All right, here we go. All right. I assume you do Zoom. Is there a way to turn that off? Do you have any
Turn
idea? That
turn what off?
recording in progress, lady.
Oh, I do have no idea.
I hate it. I hate it so much.
Yeah.
Oh, I meant to tell you. I don't know how to edit video. So anything in the video stays in the video.
That's fine.
I know how to edit the audio though. So here we are, Reverend Wendy Matthews, or
Yeah.
Matthews. Sorry, that's the book in front of you. Reverend Wendy Hudson. There we go. Already screwed up, and we're what's that say? 90 seconds into the recording. We did it. Welcome to the show. I'm excited that you're here.
Me too.
And Steve, I'm assuming you're listening, even though I don't think Steve listens to most of these, but Steve put us together. So Steve, appreciate you, my friend. But
We'll quiz him on it later. We'll like hide a little Easter egg somewhere in the conversation to find out if he actually listened the whole way through.
what does he win?
I'll buy him a coffee.
But I don't think Steve drinks real coffee. I think he drinks like that kind of, you know, coffee flavored sugar water.
I've seen him recently, and it's been like real coffee.
Really? Well, I'm
Yes,
excited for him. He's
very
grown
exciting.
up. He's grown up so well. Anyway, enough ragging on Steve. He's not here to defend himself. um, so who and what are you?
Sure. I am, oh gosh, I mean, in the metaphysical way, are you asking that, or like my particular social location?
Whatever way you want to go.
So many ways we could answer that. I guess in my social location and kind of how we got connected up, I'm the pastor at Two Rivers Church. We're a United Methodist faith community in Charleston, South Carolina. I'm also, my other primary identities are as a mom. I've got 3 teenagers, which is very fun. And I'm all those other things: friend, daughter,
That
partner.
doesn't sound fun. So I have almost one teenager,
Okay.
and it's not always that fun. Why? Are you being facetious? Like, or do I have something to look forward to?
No, I mean, I would say it is fun 75% of the time. So that's like the vast majority. I will say there's probably like 25% of the time it's a little bit challenging, but I'll
Yeah.
take the 75%. It's pretty fun.
Well, maybe there's light at the end of the tunnel. So
There is.
anyhow,
I do have an 18-year-old. They're really great when they get to that end.
because they're self-sufficient, or because you can threaten to kick them out if they just want to keep continuing to run the mouth.
Oh, see, I've been very fortunate. My oldest does not like to run his mouth in a way that is. Now, my 15-year-old is an expert at the running the mouth. So
That's the name of the episode, at the running the mouth.
if we can like survive 15, we're gonna be great.
Yeah. So for those listening, so you and I decided yesterday in a 12-minute phone conversation to have a conversation this morning with about that much prep work. And so that's what we're working with here. But honestly, these are my favorite. You had said yesterday, I'm not sure that this is all that exciting or whatever, but I honestly feel like they are, because these are the most real conversations. We're not hawking a text. We're not trying to sell a book. We're not trying to get you new members of the church. I don't even know if that's the right word. I'm Baptist. So I don't know if members is the right word for a Methodist church, but it probably is. Is that what you call
We
them?
talk about folks in our community.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, technically membership would be a thing, but we're much more about folks in our community.
Yeah. One of the best books that I've read in doing this show from like 4 years ago is called Unarmed Empire from Sean Palmer.
Ooh.
And he's out in Houston. I think it's Houston. But he has a thing where he's like, churches, you just should draw a 5-mile radius around your church. Those are your people, whether or not they give to your church, whether or not they come to your church. Like, that's your job. Stop playing games.
We run a 60-mile radius.
Oh my.
Yeah.
That's a big radius.
It is a big radius.
Yeah.
Actually, more than that, and the entire East Coast and Mexico.
What is that? What do you mean?
Those are our folks who connect themselves to our community. Our primary folks are in the 60-mile radius of Charleston. And then, but we have significant folks all up and down the Eastern Seaboard and in Mexico who consider themselves part of our community.
Yeah. So how long have you been in your vocation? Like, what is that?
I've been doing this full time for almost 20 years.
Mm,
So I can trace my call to the first time I felt this stirring or sense to be a pastor. We call that in our churchy language, like a call to ministry. The first time I kind of felt that as an idea or stirring, I was in the fourth grade. So I can
mm,
trace, kind of what do you want to be when you grow up, all the way back to the fourth grade. And I've done a couple of other things in between, but primarily have done this, my whole adult life.
mm. And so, can you give some context to that? Kind of what was your faith maybe when you started or when you got into ministry? And what has that arc looked like to whatever you are today?
Yeah. Well, my parents still attend the very, traditional United Methodist Church and, small town South Carolina that I grew up in. They still worship and attend there. And so I was one of those folks who was like, almost literally born into the church. I'm sure I was like taken to church when I was like 2 or 3 weeks old. And so all of my childhood, my most of my most vivid childhood memories take place somewhere within that building or within that community. The people who like were very influential in my life came out of that experience. So I grew up, for those of your podcast listeners, I'm a white woman, straight white woman. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a straight white woman and grew up in a very middle class, upper middle class, home life. And that was also my religious upbringing. That's my very mainline white traditional
American.
Christian American experience. Yeah, that
Yeah.
was mine growing up. And so my religious experience and my connection with God, I count myself very fortunate that I did not have any evangelical harm.
Mm,
That has been now that I'm an adult, and at least 50% of our church, if not more, are recovering evangelicals. And like when I hear
mm,
the stories of what they were taught or what they were learned or what they learned, what they were taught, what they experienced, I am just horrified. And that was not my spiritual experience growing up.
mhm.
I grew up in an understanding very much of like God is love, not very much of a powerful God, but a God of presence. That's what I would say. If I had to kind of characterize the God of my childhood, it would be a God of presence. As most people, I'm in South Carolina, as most people, you have some foray into Southern Baptist land. When you live in South Carolina, especially as a teenager, you literally cannot escape it. And so
Mm.
I had that, I had a 2-year like foray into Southern Baptism, where I was baptized again, which is a huge
This was
scandal
your
in
choice
the
to like
Methodist
change
Church.
churches or
It
your
was,
okay.
yes, a boy may have been involved.
Ah, ah.
As these things happen when you're 18. Um, um, but then it was when the last part of that experience was when I was my first year in college, and I had joined the Baptist Student Union
Mhm.
at the University of South Carolina. And I was really sensing at that time that I was really being called into to full-time ministry as a profession or as a vocation. Those are like the churchy words that we use, but like I wanted to be a pastor. And I was really like feeling that this was something that I was being called to do, that this is what, something God wanted for me. And I went to talk to my campus minister about it, and they were like, that is really great. You can work with women. And I was like, but no, I feel, I feel called to like preach to the whole church. And they were like, well, that's really awesome. You can work with children. And I was like, I do not like kids. They were like, well, those are your choices. And I was like, okay, time for me to exit this and go back to the church of my childhood.
Mm.
So I then went literally next door, because the Baptist Student Union and the Methodist Student Union were in buildings next door to each other. So I just like left one, walked in the door of the other one. And so I had the opportunity to like claim Methodism, the founder of United Methodism was named John Wesley. He was an Anglican priest. And so we call the type of theology that he really pioneered, and the expressions, we call that like Wesleyan theology. So I really was able to then claim that particular expression of God's kingdom for myself
Yeah.
as an adult,
Yeah.
kind of coming back and making that intentional choice.
I know very little about the Methodist Church. I've been to a couple funerals in the Methodist Church, and I have a good friend that is a minister. I guess that's the word I'm going to use in
Mhm.
Methodist Church just down the street.
Yep. Yep.
Um, I know her, but I don't know much about the church. So can you kind of? I honestly think that most people that are not necessarily listeners of the show, or maybe new listeners, but most people when they think of the church, they have the Jim Jeffries, they have the a model in their head, the John MacArthur of the people
Oh,
that are on
I was
the
like, I don't
news
even know those
channels.
people.
Oh, so that's Dallas, First Baptist Dallas, the
Okay.
massive one that on the 4th of July has a celebration of the birth of our Savior, the AK, the assault rifle.
Yes, yes,
Um, yeah,
absolutely.
it's as tongue in cheek as I can possibly be. Um, yeah, churches that feel more like addicted to empire, nationalism,
Yeah.
greed. Churches that look a lot like Babylon and maybe Assyria or
Yeah.
Rome, although they feel like they're the underdog in those stories. Anyway, what is can you contrast kind of
Sure.
like why there's such a big difference? And then I'd also kind of like you talked about people coming to you with stories of what they were taught. Like, can
Yeah.
you name some of those things and kind of some of the issues
Sure.
with them?
Sure. Um, I think, well, one of the biggest differences is that they let me, a lowly woman, be a preacher in Methodism.
Mm,
So I would say that's, which is really interesting when you talk about like how folks who come to us and like what they've been taught, or like recovering evangelicals, or folks who've experienced significant spiritual trauma and harm. Um, a lot of times they say one of the things that people are looking for is a church pastored by a woman. Or they're very surprised when they see that the lead pastor of this church is a woman. I mean, we are in the Deep South, so that still is an experience that is an anomaly. That's more uncommon
hmm
than common. Um, but it's really interesting that just my physical presence as a female identified person is sets such an immediate tone. And also, it somehow communicates a level of safety for folks who've experienced trauma and harm, that this is not going to be a place dominated by patriarchy, misogyny, and militarism. I mean, it's interesting that just having a female pastor for a lot of the folks who've experienced a lot of harm, just my face and being communicates something so radically different than what their previous church experiences had been. But Methodism as a whole, like our Wesleyan theology, is really a theology centered on the concept of grace and understanding. This idea that the way that we interpret it and live it out at Two Rivers Church is that we are created beautiful. I'm wearing our shirt that says trans is beautiful. Our kind of predominant tagline is "You are beautiful," and so it's on our koozies, and it's on our in rainbow. So
Yeah.
it's rainbow, you are beautiful. It's on our t-shirts, it's on our koozies, it's on our stickers on our car. It's everywhere. So that's kind of the primary this idea that we are created in beauty, that we're created in the image of God, and we're created as God's children. And that is our primary identity, is as children of God. And as children of God, we are created in beauty and beautiful. And the purpose of our human life is, in the way that we understand it, in the way that we translate it in our particular congregation, is that the purpose of our life then is recovering that sense of beauty that we've been created in, and then reshaping and remolding our life to reflect the life of beauty, grace, love, and hope and justice that Jesus shows to us. And so the kind of the primary motivation behind Wesleyan theology, Methodist theology, is this idea of grace, that there's nothing that separates us from God, that there's nothing outside of God's grace, and that we are called to live our life within it, to be transformed by it, and then as a result of that, to help transform the world into the sense of grace, welcome, beauty, love, and justice.
Mm. So to contrast that with what I was taught in my independent regular Baptist upbringing, which is it's more conservative than the Southern Baptist because
Oh
we're
boy.
yeah, yay, we're doing it. Um, yeah, yeah. So I was taught more. No, you were born wretched from that first moment of conception. You were born to perish, and but by the grace of God, which
Yeah.
is really a bad way to work through Ephesians and Colossians and to proof text that into a different meaning. But anyway, so is there no doctrine of original sin in Methodism, or is this really more of a no, this is what we do here, and if they're not happy with this, they can try to fire me?
Um, well, I can't be fired. That's a whole nother
What?
gift of
Fantastic.
the gift of the Methodist Church. In our historic doctrines, yes, John Wesley, again, who's kind of founder of our movement 300 years ago, very much adhered to the concept of original sin.
Mm,
And so that is very much present, and you will find, certain Methodists that have that as an important part of who they are. And pastors who really lean into that. I have personally found that trying to beat people over the head and to tell them that they are sinful and terrible and far away from God as their original nature is not very persuasive, or it doesn't really stick. Folks might hear that, and I certainly did, when I had my Southern Baptist foray. I was really moved initially by the fear of what would happen to me as a sinful person who might
mm,
die in a car crash on the way home. And, was my sin so great, and had I not accepted Jesus enough, that I would then burn in hell and perish forever?
mm.
Um, I mean, that was, when I was 18, was pretty persuasive when you're kind of in the midst of all of that turmoil of who you are and what you understand and who do you want to be. But that wasn't, it didn't stick, and it didn't cause me to change my life. And that's what I have found in most people that I've talked to in my 20 years as a pastor, and especially in the last 4 years that we've been doing this particular work, that understanding is not helpful, that it's harmful, that it does not cause people to have an engaging, loving, positive, life-changing experience with God.
Yeah. So when you preach that on a Sunday
Yeah.
or a Tuesday, whatever,
Yeah.
the day that ends in day is, that you happen to do that because this is a COVID world, and so you can really
Right.
you can do your church whenever you feel like tuning into Zoom. Um, when you say that, what is the response not from your people that attend the services with you, but from the community and from the church at large? Because that's a big difference than a lot of the churches that I hear preach. I went to church a few weeks ago in Texas when I went back home for a week, and I was like, oh, I loved where you were, and then it was beautiful, and you pivoted to something so awful.
Yeah.
Um, he took the Beatitudes and turned it into something about power, which is really impressive.
Did you really
Really
read the Beatitudes?
well. We he read the whole Beatitudes, and then we stuck on the very first verse, and then we ended up in Revelation, and we ended up in a bunch of other places that I was like, well, I don't
Fascinating.
I don't understand how. Anyway, I was respectful. I didn't say anything. I didn't trying to pick any fights, but yeah. So, what is the response when you preach, justice and equality, and
Yeah.
in the community at large that you're in?
It's been It's fascinating because I've been in Charleston for 10 years, which is a wonderful gift. Methodist preachers typically move around because of the way that our polity, our structure is set up. I liken it to arranged marriages. So every year, like our leaders sit in a like for the state, sit in a big room, and they have a list of all of the Methodist pastors. They have a list of all the churches, and then they essentially like make arranged marriages between the pastors and the churches. And so that happens for 1 year at a time, which really freaks out people who like hire their pastors, and pastors stay for a lifetime. And so usually we stay in a place for anywhere 4 or 5 years. This kind of has been typical. And so it's unusual that I have been in one city for 10 years. You know, the great gift of that, though, is that I've been in one city for 10 years. So I have a lot of relationships, contacts, connections for my kids going to school, to places that I shop, to groups that I'm in. I know a ton of people, and not a lot of, you know, of course, some of those people come to church, but some of those people will never step foot into our church space. Some of those people consider me to be their pastor, even though they've never, ever attended one of our formal worship services. Some of those folks will, you know, consider us to be, or I get this a lot. If I ever were to go to a church, I would go to yours. And so it has been a very surprising message, this one of beauty, you know, like walking, we were talking before we started recording about like t-shirts, and the t-shirt that I'm wearing right now, you know, says trans is beautiful. And again, we have this whole tagline, you are beautiful, and it's everywhere. Probably my favorite story is when we did Pride a couple of years ago, our Charleston Pride. We had you know, our t-shirts, and we had stickers, and we had 1,000. We still have 1,000 of these koozies that say "You are beautiful." And on the day of Pride, we attached a rainbow flag to a little card and koozies, and we gave them out. And later on that week, I went into Starbucks, and I was wearing my "You Are Beautiful" t-shirt. And the person who was checking me out was like, "Oh my gosh, were you at Pride?" And I was like, "Yeah, I was at Pride." And you're like, "I love that shirt." And I was, and then she's like, "Wait, didn't you have a koozie?" I was like, "Yeah." She's like, "I have that koozie." I was like, "That's so awesome." And then somebody who was next to her was like, "Oh my gosh, really? You have a koozie? I want a koozie." And somebody else said, "Wait, but I want one." And I was like, "Hang on." And I ran to my car, opened up my trunk where I still had a box of the flags and the koozies and the stickers. And I brought them into the store. And I gave out a dozen of the koozies and the flags and the little cards, like to both folks, baristas who were working, and to just people who were in the Starbucks and who saw them and were like, "Hey, I want one of those." To me, that's one of my favorite stories about this message, is that you are beautiful. Especially folks LGBTQ community, that, you know, is one of our kind of, you know, primary constituencies in our congregation, in our community. They have, especially LGBTQ folks, queer folks, have spent their entire lives swimming in the cultural message that you are broken, that there's something wrong with you, that this is not right, that people have been told you are ugly, not physical beauty, but just, you know, the attribute of being who you are. And this message and idea that you are beautiful, not because I said so, but because God said so, because God made you exactly like that, and God made you in the image of beauty. Folks can hardly believe it.
Yeah, no, I agree. The most recent thing I've gotten used to saying is just "love is a noun," but that is it's pointed at humans, not necessarily God. Yeah, it's one of my favorite things. So theologically speaking, for you as a person, just for Wendy, you're like, yeah. What did you struggle the most with as you kind of went through training and whatnot, to found a church like Two Rivers that is a different form of church? Because most churches have a massive amount of legacy, and it handicaps what they're allowed to do. Or, you know, pastors are told you can officiate a same-sex wedding, you can talk about racism, you can talk about white supremacy, you can talk about this, but I'm going to need you to tone it back if you want me to continue to pay you to be a minister here. Like, I'm going to need you to dial it way back. So what was the biggest thing for you where you were like, "Oh man, that you struggled with getting into where you're at now?
One of the, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. One of the great gifts of, we started our church. We just celebrated our third birthday in March. So, we started the whole process about 4 years ago. And the great gift in that, we always say, is that the only bad habits that we have so much freedom, so much flexibility. One of our things we say all the time is we can do whatever we want. Like whenever we get stuck on something, we're like, what should we do? We're like, okay, we can do whatever we want. And that's a lot of freedom. And then also, whenever we hit a barrier or an obstacle, we say, this is God's invitation to creativity. So like anytime we get a pushback or a bump up against something, like this is God's invitation to creativity, and we will rejoice. So a way of kind of flipping all that around. And also the great gift is that the only bad habits we have are the habits that we have started ourselves. And we know what they are. And there is a ton of freedom in starting something new. Probably the most difficult habit that I had to overcome was language, because I grew up in a mainline church. I have been a Christian from the moment of my conception. Essentially, I was raised in a very loving Christian household. I never had a crisis of faith as such. I've certainly had my moments of like doubt and wondering, but never. Those have always been springboard moments. I never had like a cratering moment of that. I was seminary trained. I spent 14 years in established churches. So all of my language was so churchy, so churchy, so churchy. That was, that's all I've done pretty much as an adult. And very quickly realized when we were starting Two Rivers that the folks that we wanted to connect with were people who did not go to church. There were people who had either been harmed by church, who had said, I'm never stepping foot back in church again, who had never been to church as an adult, who never had any connection to God that they wanted to pursue. We believe that God's always been connected to people. We don't choose that. God's primary way of being is connection with us. We choose whether we interact with that or not. But the biggest thing was having to de-churchify my language. And so the first year that we worshiped together, two folks and I, we would sit after every single worship service, everything that we wrote, everything that we spoke, and we would evaluate every single word that we said, every single transition, every single illustration, every single image, and say, okay, don't say this instead. You need to define this, not that. You need to, and I had to learn a whole new vocabulary. And it's wonderful. And it was hard work. But it's how, if there are any pastor people listening out there, really listen to what you say. The best thing you can do is then find somebody who is not a Christian and not a church, and let them listen to what you say, and then have them give you honest feedback about it. And 90% of the time, they'll be like, I really had no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. So this isn't a fair question, but since you're,
I love these.
since you're a minister, I figure why not? So what is the church's responsibility with what is currently happening with the refugees that we have created over 2 decades in Afghanistan?
Right.
And I say we've created very intentionally for the same reason that there's refugees from the southern portions of North America and the northern regions of the South American continent, because we got to make money down there and we're America, so deal with it. But that's a different topic, but very similar. What is the church's role and responsibility in the world that we currently sit in as it relates to that?
I mean, we are a people, as Jesus followers, we are people who have, hitched our wagon to a political refugee. So it's like that is, Jesus and his parents, fled to Egypt, fleeing for their life from a despotic ruler who was seeking out to kill them. And lived in Egypt as a refugee until they returned back. So the plight of refugees is also our plight. and the connection that we have to folks who are fleeing for safety is the story of the person who we claim to follow and is the savior of the world. And so in them, we very much see Jesus because their story is the story of Jesus. And so I think we both have a level of responsibility for creating safety and welcome and asylum and shelter, as folks arrive here. That's very, very important. And then also, I think we can't advocate as well. We can't abdicate our responsibility to speak loudly and clearly on behalf of justice and creating responsibilities and possibilities for more folks to come, for more folks to be allowed in. One of our folks had just recently traveled to the southern U.S. border, in Texas, New Mexico U.S. border, to spend time in some of the refugee and asylum seeking communities there. And it's a story that's not talked about, I think, outside of Texas border communities or, those like United States southern border communities. I mean, I consider myself pretty dialed into the state of the world and the things that she shared, her experiences, what she saw. I just had no idea.
Yeah.
And it broke my heart. And the hard thing is I can only carry too closely so many heartbreaking things, because then I won't be able to get up off the floor. And I think that's a tough part about being a follower of Jesus in the world today, is we see Jesus, to me, the most clearly in those who are suffering. And to be so closely tied, there's the whole world is suffering. We are suffering and bearing the weight of that, and trying to discern, where do I as an individual, where do we as a community, where do we as a church place our efforts and energy with those who are suffering, is really hard.
Yeah. I had an argument with someone the other day that I don't know on the internet, because that's what the world is.
We can't see each other to argue in person anymore.
Well, I don't actually argue with people in person. I really only argue with them on the internet, mostly because I think I have time to choose my words. And then, but in person, I don't have that time, and there's no empathy on the internet. You know what I mean? It's just different.
Yeah.
I don't know. I really should probably just delete all the social media, all of it. But I won't, because that's the world that we live in.
It can be used for good.
Yeah, but it's still, what's the word? It takes a lot of work to do so, because you just can't read the comments. You just got to put what you want to put up there and then leave. Don't even
never read the comments.
Yeah. And I don't read the comments for the show, which is probably for the best, but that's okay. So no, we got in an argument about, rescuing refugees, and they were saying, we should only be rescuing the Christians that are there, because I was like, you're ridiculous. You're ridiculous.
I do know that Jesus wasn't a Christian, right?
Yeah. And do you also know that the Syriac, I'm sure he doesn't, but without Syriac Muslims, there would be no Christianity today, because they sheltered and housed them, and vice versa. There's a massive shared brotherhood there of love, and somehow we forgot that exists. But for those listening, you should read the work of Vince Bantu if you want to dig into that and fall down that rabbit hole and learn something new. I've heard it said by a couple ministers that being a pastor in today's church is like managing long-term hospice care. Do you agree with that? And hospice care for the entity of the church. And so as, new reports roll in, church memberships roll in, and things seem to never really systematically, I don't know which word. We'll edit the right one in. Change. Do you feel as though that's accurate in your experience?
I mean, now I'm fortunate is that I'm on the midwife end.
Mm-hmm. You're
which
birthing
is
something new.
exactly,
Mm.
exactly, which there is. I have always said, like for my whole ministry and, for the last 20 years, and even more so now, um, we can't say post-COVID in this whatever,
I don't know that there will ever be a
no,
post-COVID.
but in whatever portion of COVID that, the world exists in, um, this is the best time to be a follower of Jesus. This is the best time to be, in my opinion, to be a pastor, because there are so many folks who are not connected to Jesus. And I think is wonderful.
Mm.
Most of my colleagues and peers, unfortunately, live and serve and work in those hospice connections, but almost the worst kind, where people don't realize that they're dying. And so instead of embracing the end of life and all the possibilities that come with that, like I had a guy at one of my last churches who was single his whole life, had tuberculosis when he was in his
Mm.
20s, and like
Mm.
spent 9 months in a tuberculosis sanatorium. I mean, like this is like back in the day.
Oh man.
Single his whole life, never thought he would live past 50, and here he was like 70, and he was diagnosed with a very aggressive type of cancer. So he was like, I've lived way longer than I ever thought I was. And they're like, we can, like, these are the treatments: surgery, radiation, chemotherapy. You won't be able to eat. Da, 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 da. And he was like, are you kidding? He's like, they're like, or you can go on hospice. He's like, I never thought I'd live this long. Bring on hospice.
Let's do the
And
thing.
buddy, I have never seen somebody embrace. He used every single bit of the hospice care that was offered to him. He had the music therapist come. He had the health care workers come. He had nurses come. He had volunteers come. He had the chaplain come. I mean, like every day. And he
Mm.
lived for 6 months. His quality of life, those last 6 months, were honestly far better than they were the last 20 years of his
Mm.
life. He was like, you're going to give me hospice. Fantastic. I mean, he was both feet in. And I've never seen someone with a more joyful end of life.
Huh. That's
It
amazing.
was so full of meaning and care and hope, and people surrounding him, and people like living out, the folks with hospice living out their gifts in his life. And he was able to facilitate that in this
Mm.
really incredible way. And so at his funeral, like the music therapist or the music hospice worker came and sang the song that they had written together. I mean, it
Mm.
was just wonderful.
Mm. That is
Um,
cool.
because he knew that death was part of life and that death was not an end. For him, he was very faithful follower of Jesus. For him, death was not an end. It was not something to be feared. Instead, it was just a transition point to something incredible. We, as the institutional church, are not faithful in our understanding of death. I can only
Mm.
speak for the United Methodist denomination. I see this lived all the time. We live in nothing but fear and panic and anxiety, and oh my God, we're going to die. And I'm like, are you kidding? Death is fantastic, because without death, you don't get new life. You don't
Mm.
get, I mean, we are a resurrection people. We believe that the best comes after death. So why are we so afraid of it?
Mm.
I think if we as a denominational entity, as the church in America, could live the way that Mr. Jackie lived, that we could embrace the end of our life, we could see that there are all the gifts in it, and we could prepare for what comes next. Imagine what our churches would be like if we were like, we're going to give up all of ourselves for the sake of people who've never heard of Jesus or who've never connected with Jesus. And we're going to give all of our resources, all of our people resources, all of our past, we're going to release our pastors to go spend all their life with people who are on the birthing end.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to take care of each other because we know how to do that. And we're going to set ourselves up for life after death.
Mm.
You don't think
So,
that.
yeah, no, we don't.
And it's
And we,
not faithful. It is not faithful.
yeah, I want to lean into that midwife metaphor because I like it. And then the first thought that I had is if ministers and reverends or whatever pastors
Yeah.
are acting in the role of the midwife, who should be acting in the role of doula? Because from what I understand of that,
Ooh, I love that.
midwife is like right up until we go, and then I've got to go to the next birth. Like I'm qualified to do this. and then the doula kind of sticks with you emotionally postpartum and helps to emotionally and prepare the family and yourself, and so who should be acting in that role?
I mean, I think that is the role of the community. The role of
Mhm.
the community is to midwife and to midwife and doula each other and
Mhm.
more out into the world. And so one thing that we've really adopted at Two Rivers is we have a really flat structure, a really flat leadership structure. um, I'm the lead pastor, but we function very flat. We don't function hierarchically at all. And we believe that every person in our community has gifts that are necessary, needed, valid, and equal for the building of the community. And so, one person's gift is not my gift as, the pastor, the kind of the leader, the one who kind of like keeps us going, setting a direction. I am only able to do that though, because everybody else is sharing their gifts of listening to other people, of helping teach children to read, of developing spiritual formation in our children, of showing up on a Sunday, of setting up of chairs back when we did that thing, of popping onto Facebook and engaging in the comments, of giving their money, of saying, I had this relationship that I'd like to nurture, like Stephen here. See Stephen's gift of introducing the two of us, like that's like, so all of those gifts are equally valid. One is not higher or
Mm.
more important than the other. And in that way, we're all midwifing and we're all serving as a doula at the same time.
Mm. No, I like that. So 2 questions left, and then I'm going to run to work. I'm going to
Yeah.
let you probably get back to work. What do you feel like churches need to be saying at church, just to be passive aggressive with the name of the show? Not necessarily the ministers of the church, but what should people feel enabled and maybe you think necessary needs to be discussed in the coming years? And if not, it's going to be detrimental to the church as a whole, Big C Church.
I mean, I will address American Christianity because that's my context and what I
Sure.
know. And so I would say anti-racism and white supremacy. We, especially those of us who are white and white churches, that has to be up there. LGBTQ inclusion, full inclusion, for me, obviously that's a part of who we are. It has to be there. And then also anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism.
Mm.
We talk a lot about intersectionality. We live at intersections. Well, one of our sayings also is like pride is always intersectional. And it's all of you can't split out those things because people show up in the space in all of their identities. We don't make people show up only as one identity. People show
Hmm.
up in all of their identities. And so as the American church, if we are going to have any, I hate to use the word relevancy, but I'm going to use it. If we are going to have any relevancy to the folks who live in the United States in these days, we have to talk about those things because that is people's lived experience. And it is foolish of us to pretend like it doesn't exist.
Mm. So for you as a person, when you try to wrap words around what God is,
Oh.
what is that?
Um, when I use the centering practice of centering prayer, which is usually you pick like one word that you then like repeat or focus on or create. And I even hate to say it. It sounds so hokey to say love, but not emotion, but not the like so far deeper than like, nothing Hallmark related, but it's like, it's a love that a parent has for a child, that a lover has for another lover, in that first blush deepness, when you're first having that formed relationship. Love that defies definition and categorization and description even. I'd say that.
Mm. Love it. Love it. That's my favorite question of every single one of these. I started it like 2 years ago. It is my favorite question. I don't know why. I often get more out of the answers of those
Yes, yes.
than the entire episode. Yeah.
Agreed.
So normally we have a book that we're directing people to. But we don't have any of that. And so when people listen to this, and at the end they're like, "Well, I need to say stuff about this. I need to
Yeah,
do something, or I feel
yeah.
led to try to do X, Y, or Z." Where should they go to try to begin to plug into things that you feel like matter?
Yeah. You can connect with me. I'm Rev Wendy Hudson on all social media. So follow me, connect with me, check in with me there. And then we are also Two Rivers CHS. So TWORIVERSCHS on all social media. And that's also our website, tworiverschs.org.
Hmm.
Come and find us. And you too can have your own You Are Beautiful, Trans is Beautiful, Jesus is a Feminist t-shirt. You can see shop our store,
Hmm.
um, or
That'll
tote
work.
bag, or fanny pack, or visor, or
Fanny pack.
we got it all.
Fanny
Our
pack.
creative director is super creative.
Oh, fanny pack. So my wife wore a fanny pack. I feel like they did something. So my wife's a pediatric nurse, and they did something for the kids, and she had to have a fanny pack, and it is the 80s LA gear.
The best then.
Oh my! And she put it on. I was like, I get why you're doing it, but I don't want to know you today. Don't like I can't do the fanny pack.
Leave the house separately.
Oh, and now my daughter has a fanny pack, and
I love it.
I'm not happy about any of it.
I should send
But
you one.
God, if, I don't know. I don't know about that. Steve, don't get any ideas. Anyway, Wendy, thank you so much for coming on and for your time this morning.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right, I'll end that there.